Tonight's lecture concerns itself with the Rambam and the nevochim. The Rambam was a controversial figure in his lifetime. He remained a controversial figure after his lifetime, especially for the first 2 or 3 generations after his death. But the Rambam remains Hanesher HaGodol, the great eagle. And the eagle, as Chazal tell is the symbol of the Jewish people because it flies higher than all other birds and is able to carry its young on its wings. Kenesher Yoyer Kino Al Gozalov Yerachef. The Rambam spread his wings, and all of us for almost 1,000 years, over 900 years from the Rambam's birth, that we're coming to this in the 2035 will be 900 years from the Rambam's birth. We will be able to say that we have all been protected by his great wings. The Rambam is a gentle person, except when it comes to intellectual argument. And when it comes to intellectual argument, the Rambam can be fierce, as his critics were fierce. And the Rambam himself writes in one of his letters that one should never take objection to fierce criticism as long as it is not personal. And in his fashion, it certainly was not personal, but more than that, he enjoyed the debate. And so the nevochim, this book that he wrote, so there are a number of misconceptions about it that have to, so to speak, be cleared up. I mentioned that the copy of the nevochim that I'm using is the translation of Rabbi Kapach, and from the original Arabic. And this translation, he says, and most scholars say, is much more accurate than the usual translation, which was done by the Ibn Tibon family. And the Rambam saw it in his lifetime. He said it was a good translation, but he said if he had time, he would rewrite it. But he didn't have time. And so for years, we only had the Ibn Tibon translation, but now we have this translation by Rabbi Kapach. The Rambam says, Hashem Elokim Emes. The Lord God is truth. What is truth? So the Rambam says that truth belies the fact that there are people who on the exterior can appear as Jews, not only appear as Jews, but appear as good Jews. And we'll see later how strongly he speaks about it. But it's not emes. It's not true. Why isn't it not true? Because there's no intellect in their service of God. They never thought about God. They never thought about the values of Judaism. And the Rambam says in his inimitable fashion, it's like people who chop wood, he says. They do mitzvahs like they chop wood, or like they thresh grain. Meaning that, so we have the great story of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, who saw the Jewish people in a different light, in an emotional light. So he saw a Jew greasing the wheels of his wagon with his talis and tefillin on while he was davening. And so somebody said, look at that Shegitz, was terrible, right? In the middle of davening with his talis and tefillin on, he's greasing the wheels of his wagon. And Rabbi Yitzchak said, look at that wonderful Jew, even while he's greasing his wagon, he has talis and tefillin on and he's praying to God. So there's an attitude here. But the Rambam's attitude is intellect. It's rational. The Rambam says, B'chol jochecha do'ehu. The Rambam emphasizes over and over again that the task of a Jew is v'yodata hayom. You have to know God. It's not sufficient to think of God as a nice old man with a white beard who somehow sits in heaven And that's my concept of him. Doehu, v'yodata, man das, ki Hashem hu Elokim. And because of that, he says here, Asiyas oson ha-mitzvos beivorim achitzonim. Doing mitzvahs with our body, lelo yediyas ha-mitzvahs bohen, without understanding what the mitzvah comes to do. Now, this is a point. The Rambam is the champion in giving tameh ha-mitzvos, explaining why the mitzvah exists. The Rambam says not only to explain why the Rambam says it's an obligation upon us to try and understand why the mitzvah exists, not just to do it. Now, the Rambam is marchik leches. The Rambam goes a long way. He says a lot of things that a lot of people disagreed with very, very bitterly. The Rambam basically uses the concept that the Jewish idea is against paganism to explain myriad mitzvahs. The Rambam says shatnes, for instance. The Rambam attempts to explain mitzvahs that are chukim, that by definition are not understandable. Even Porah Aduma he hazards reasons for. So he says shatnes is because the non-Jewish world had a superstition regarding linen and wool together. That if you wore linen, I mentioned today, you know, the red string that exists in the world, right? So linen and wool was like the red string. If you wore linen and wool together, then the gods were pacified. So he says the Torah came and said not to wear linen and wool. He says lo savashel gdiba chalevi mo, which we read in today's parsha. So the question is, lo savashel gdiba chalevi mo, it speaks about milchiks and fleishiks, right? About dairy and meat. So why didn't the Torah just say straight, don't drink milk with a steak? Where did they get such a weird thing? And it's repeated 3 times, the pasuk in the Torah, not to cook a young goat in the milk of its mother. Why did the Torah tell it to us that way? So, if you ask that Shaila in Cheder, so your Rebbe will tell you, keep quiet. That's as a state, right? That's the way it is, and you got to accept it that way. The Rambam says, because in the ancient world, that was the method of worshiping idols. There's a book, a set of books called Olam HaTanakh, which was published here in Israel. It's an encyclopedia on Tanakh, and every pasuk in Tanakh. It's very, very interesting, completely non-traditional, but it has very interesting things in it. So on this pasuk, Lo Savashel Gdiba Chalevi Mo, they found all sorts of documents that this was the form of worshiping certain of the Canaanite gods, that they would take the mother of the goat would take they would take the young goat and they would milk the mother's milk, and then they would cook the goat in the mother's milk, and that also somehow was a fertility rite. And so the Rambam says this tremendous chiddush, that the Torah spoke to its generation. The Torah speaks to all generations, but the Torah had to speak to its generation, and the generation of the Mekablei HaTorah, the people who stood at Sinai. And the Torah therefore had to express itself in language that would be understandable to that generation. So in that generation, if you told them not to cook the little kid, the little goat, in its mother's milk, they understood the message. Not only the message of meat and milk, they understood the message of paganism, of anti-paganism, of standing against Avodah Zarah. And therefore, he says that's why the Torah gave it that way. And that's a shita that he has throughout. Now that grates on our ears because we think of the Torah as eternal, but the Rambam also thinks of it as eternal. And the Rambam says the eternity of Torah is expressed through the oral law, through the Torah Shabbal Peh, which interprets Lo Savah Shel Gedi B'Chalev Imo, so that in the year 2002 or 2003, we can understand Lo Savah Shel Gedi B'Chalev Imo, that we have 4 different refrigerators. That's speaking to us. That came through the oral law. But in the generation when Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to them, Moshe had to speak to them in their language. And in their language, Lo Savah Shel Gedi B'Chalev Imo was the counteraction against paganism. In our world, we don't suffer so much from paganism. We have a lot of things that we suffer from, but there really is not a great demand in the Jewish street to bow down to wood or metal idols. People don't go out and do that. There are all sorts of other temptations. And therefore, to us, we didn't have to have it phrased that way. But to that generation had to do it that way. So the Rambam calls that Yedias HaMitzvos, to understand the mitzvah, to understand not only the performance of the mitzvah, but to understand why the mitzvah exists. What is the mitzvah here to do? The Rambam has numerous examples of that. So he says sometimes the Torah itself told it to you, and to put on tefillin, your arm and your head, so then a person should have in mind that one's arm, which represents one's bodily actions, and one's head, which represents our minds, our intellect, should be dedicated to God. So the Torah itself told us that. But there are many things that the Torah did not tell us. So the third section of the more nevochim is devoted to tamei mitzvahs. Now when that's devoted to tamei mitzvahs, everybody in the world jumped on him. And that was really one of the main controversies that existed. You should know that Jews didn't accept the more nevochim easily. In fact, they burned it. The zealots who lived in Provence, so the Yad Ramah, Reb Meir Alevi Abulafia, who was a Rav in Montpellier, in Provence, so he led the charge against the Rambam. And he was joined in it by Rabbeinu Yonah Ibn Gerundi, Rabbeinu Yonah of Gerona, who the Ramban later will be his Talmud, the Rashba will be his Talmud. And they argued intellectually against it. And the Ravid also certainly argued intellectually against many of the precepts of the Rambam. But the leaders argue intellectually. When it gets down to a lower level, so then the argument becomes one of zealotry. And the zealots went and they informed the Catholic Church that the Rambam's book is anti-Christian, which it certainly is. The Rambam had zero tolerance for Christianity. He held that it was paganism. Which the Ashkenazim disagreed with. That's a different discussion. And because of that, the church gathered up all the books of the Rambam, and under the instigation of Jews, burned them. The Rambam was defended by many of the scholars of Provence. Provence in northern Spain was really where the action was, and then in France as well. And what happened later was that the King of France, as I mentioned in one of the other lectures, Louis IX, burned all the copies of the Talmud in France because he said if the Rambam is anti-Christian, it must be based upon the Talmud. The Talmud is anti-Christian. So where the new Museum of the Louvre is, you know, that triangle in the courtyard in Paris, there in 1240, all the copies of the Talmud in France were confiscated and burned. And because of that, all the yeshivas had to leave France, and really the exile from France began then. And because of that, the opponents of the Rambam again, on the upper level said, well, it looks like that in heaven they voted for the Rambam. Because if we allowed that his books be burned, so the Ribono Shalom showed us that if you start burning books, you can burn other books as well. But it's because of his rational approach which frightened people. Frightened them. Nobody likes to think. My Rebbe always used to say that in the yeshiva. He used to tell him a piece of Torah. He never argued with you, but he used to say, he'd say, Berl, did you think about this? And I say, Rebbe, sure I thought about it. How else could I have come up with this great ingenious answer that reconciles, two contradictory Tosafos? So you say, go home and think about it. He says, no, think about it. And the truth of the matter is that I never thought about it before. It was just like a great inspiration that came in my mind. I never thought out all of the consequences. I never really analyzed it. I just said it. When I was a lawyer, so in our office, the senior partner used to give us signs to put on our desk that we could look at, but that the client would never see. And one of the signs was, be certain not to operate mouth unless brain is in gear. And that is a difficult thing to accomplish, to think. So the Rambam says here, Lelo yedias ha-mitzvahs, ulelo yedias mahuson umataroson, without understanding what the mitzvah is and what its purpose is, Eino ela kamisha chofer guma bakarka, he's only someone that's digging with a shovel, ukamisha chotev eitzim bayar, or somebody that's chopping wood in the forest. So that takes care of a lot of people. And that's why he didn't make it popular. The Rambam quotes a famous Gemara. It's in his פירוש HaMishnah. It's to the Mishnah in Nida. So there's a machlokes in the Mishnah in Nida regarding a certain case which is highly theoretical. And what would be the din of the woman in such a highly theoretical case? So the Gemara said, the Mishnah says there, Amar Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua said to the Tanakama who constructed this hypothetical case, Ad she'atem mesaknin es hashotos bo v'tiknu es hapikchos. But instead of spending your time dealing with the fools, why don't you do something for the intelligent people? So the Rambam says, what does he mean by that? So the Rambam says, Inyan divrei Rabbi Yoshua shu omer, b'mokom shenedaber v'nidon b'to'os, nidon b'sheinon to'os. Let us devote ourselves not to those who make mistakes, but to those who think that they don't make mistakes. Heich dineim, what should they do? Ki'ilu romes, the Rambam says that Rabbi Yeshua says, Diyun shanachnu bo kosher ma'od v'dinav merubin. We're talking about a very complicated case. All the dinim of Nida are very complicated. Einonu yecholim lagia letachlis achilukim arabim she'efshorus mitziuson krova. So the question on cases that are realistic are enormously difficult. So then why do you go and invent a case that's purely theoretical, that almost has no practical value? Loma lonu laniach hanochos she'efshoruson rechoka kegon zu. Why should we deal even with such a case? He puts these words in Rabbi Yeshua's mouth. V'im nisasek b'diyon b'ma yia adin hazeh. And he said, if we spend all of our time on these theoretical cases, yisrachiv adover, it'll become widespread, v'nitrad melasok b'nochutz yoser, and we won't have time to deal with reality. So you won't hear that Rambam in the yeshiva world. because their theoretical cases abound. What will happen if? So it's interesting to note that in halacha, most of the halacha, contrary to what people believe, most practical halacha comes from the shilas of tshuvas of the rabbis, not from the Shulchan Aruch and its commentaries. So there's a famous sefer, the Trumas Hadeshin. Trumas Hadeshin was written in the 14th century by Rabbi Sorel Isserlin, who was a great Rav in Bohemia, and it was the basic book of Ashkenazic psak in his time. The Shach says in Chosher Mishpat, it's called Trumas Hadeshin because the numerical value of Deshin, the Dalet is 4 and the Shin is 300 and the Nun is 50, so it's 354, and that's the number of days that exist in a lunar year. And therefore you were supposed to learn one question and answer every day of the year. After a year you would know the entire sefer. It's like an apple a day. The Shach says, then the Shach quotes him all the time, all the Ashkenazim quote him all the time. The Shach says in the Chosher Mishpat, he says, I have a doubt whether we should accept the Trumas Hadeshin as an authority, as a source. Why? Because he says he made up the questions. Nobody came and asked him those 354 questions. He made up the questions and he made up the answers. He says Torah is only to be trusted. Hashem imo halacha kamoso b'chol mokom. The halacha is only when the real question is asked, when there's a person before you. Then we can rely, because then we say there's godly help. The Rabboni Shalom helps the Talmud Chochem, he helps the Dayan. But if you make up the question, it's all theory. Who can rely on theory, the Shach says. And that's the Rambam here. The Rambam says, Rabbi Yeshua said it's all theory. We're not interested in theory, we're interested in practice. And therefore, the Rambam says that one should not waste one's time in such theoretical pursuits, but one should deal with halacha on a practical basis. Again, whether that would be acceptable today, I don't know, but that was his opinion. The Rambam says, Yesod ha-yesodos v'amud ha-chochmos, the basis of all Judaism, and the pillar upon which all logic rests, is ladas es Hashem. We have to know God. Know God. Ladas es Hashem. Ki choshuv etzli lahasbir yesod meha-yesodos yoser mechol dover acher shani melamed. And therefore he said, I concentrate on the knowledge of God. That's what I come to tell you. And that was his view of philosophy. Philosophy was not the knowledge of the world. It was not the psychology of human beings. It was knowledge of God. And therefore, anything that contributes to the knowledge of God, and that's what he writes, like the knowledge of astronomy, to know how the heavens work, the knowledge of physics, of the physical world, and the knowledge of anything that will contribute to some knowledge of God, he says that is all holy and that's all Torah. The Rambam believed in, not in Aristotle's philosophy, but he believed in Aristotle's physical world. That he adopted. And also in the astronomy of his time, and also in the medicine of his time. So when we look at it now, you know, as I mentioned, 850, 900 years after the Moreh Nevochim, so there are a lot of things that no longer hold water for us. We live in a time where science or our knowledge has shown us different understandings. But the principle remains the same. If I understand physics, if I understand higher mathematics, if I understand anything in intellect, then I understand, so to speak, I come closer to understanding God, if to the extent that such a thing is possible. And the Rambam says that's the pshat b'chol drochecha doehu. Know God in every way possible. Because that all contributes to our faith and to our knowledge. And let me read you a piece from the Rambam. The Rambam wrote a letter called Mamar Trias HaMesim. The Rambam wrote a number. There's this beautiful sefer called Igros HaRambam, the letters of the Rambam. So there's the Igeres Taimon, the letter that he wrote to the Jews of Yemen. The Rambam saved the Jews of Yemen by allowing them to, on the surface, become Muslims while they practiced Judaism. And after 60, 70 years, the Gzeira passed, and the Jews of Yemen remained Jews, loyal Jews. And not only that, the Jews of the Yemen remained loyal to the Rambam. The Rambam was included in their Kaddish. He used to say, B'chayechon of Yomechon, of Yomei, the Marono, Rabbono, Moshe ben Maimon. Because he saved them as Jews. So they mentioned him in the Kaddish. They mentioned him for hundreds of years after he died. And Rav Kapach, who's a Yemenite Rav, says in his introduction, he also is a Jew that minces no words. I mentioned that I knew him, a small Jew. He was 4'8". He had a mind that was, 15 meters. Just unbelievable, what a person. We used to go to the same barber together. He always used to say to me, Ra'iti otcha b'li kippah. So he says here in the beginning, he says openly, he says the Lithuanians think they know the Rambam, right? Reb Chaim, he said, the Rambam never meant anything. We know what the Rambam meant. He says, I have the tradition for hundreds and hundreds of years from my grandfather and from my father and from his grandfather. This is the pshat in the Rambam. And this little Jew wrote a 22-volume commentary to the Mishnah Torah all by himself, without research assistance, without anybody, without a computer. And in it is the Yemenite interpretation of the Yoda Chazaka. And there he quotes the begrudgingly he quotes the Lithuanians as well. But they felt that they knew the Rambam. So here he wrote this Mamar Trias HaMesim. Jews doubted the idea of the resurrection. They wanted to know whether it's one of the principles of faith. And they want to know why the Rambam included it as one of the 13 principles of faith. So in the beginning, the Rambam says as follows. I want to read the words. Kasher nechlatznu lekach. We were forced, he said, to write this book. Ro'inu she'ein min hatzedek shenigash lomo sherotzinu levayer lekare prote adinim. I didn't understand why I should approach to write the details of the Torah. Ve'aniach yesodosov muznochim. But the principles upon which the Torah is based, nobody talks about. In other words, people write about the trees, nobody writes about the forest. Ubifrat kasher motzonu echor hamadamim. The Rambam here writes about a certain scholar in his time that denied that Trias HaMesim is one of the principles of Judaism. So people think shehu chacham. People think he's a wise man. He's a big Talmud Chacham. V'shu mechachme Yisrael be'emes. And that he really is, a top-flight scholar. V'shu yodea derech halacha. And he knows how to paskin shaylas. He knows how to give the halacha. V'yisein v'yitein b'molchamto shel Torah minu urav lefi dimyono. And since he was a young man, he is always learning and he's always dealing in halacha and in Torah. And he's in doubt whether or not God somehow has corporeal aspects to him. Maybe when it says in the Chumash, God's hand, God's eyes, God's ears, he thinks that maybe that's true, that God has eyes, ears, and somehow there is a body to him. So he says, Karo min v'apikeris. I call him to be a min, and he's a big Talmud Chacham. I say he's an apikeris, the Rambam says. V'dome lozeh shomati al miktsas mishelo reisiv. I've heard about other Talmidei Chachomim. Kasher yodanu es eila amafsidim me'od, that they destroy things. Heim medamim shehem chachmei Yisrael. They portray themselves as they're the wise men of Israel. Ve'heim ayoser secholim bivnei odom. They're the most foolish of people. I told you the Rambam doesn't mince words. V'yoser toim min abehemos, he said. They're lower than animals to say such a thing. Ukvar nisalu mochoseim ploos va'azoyos v'dimyonos. And their mind is filled with miracles. The Rambam is anti-miracle. He's anti-graves. He's anti-everything that's popular in the Jewish world today. He's out of that. He has no room for that. Dimyonos nifsodim, all sorts of imaginary things. Sgulas. Ra'inu shekein roish and nevayer b'chibureinu. So therefore I included in my work, in the Yoda Chazokah, the first part of the Yoda Chazokah has nothing to do with practical halacha. It talks about Jewish belief. Klomar mashe kosher beyichud. What do we mean that God is one? What is one? We say it Hashem echod. What is that? What does that mean? So we say it, and we say it twice a day, at least, and that's our mantra, that's our slogan. So that everybody say, what's the pshat? What does it mean? Yeah, I don't. So you're saying your pshat, right? We have to say what his pshat is. So, what's the idea of yichud? So the Rambam says yichud is not one. Yichud means unique. It doesn't mean one. Because if you say one, then there has to be a two. In logic. U'b'olam haba, what do people think about olam haba? The Rambam portrays for us a very bland time of Mashiach. The Rambam's messianic era is much more bland, and so it could be that 950 years or 900 years later, we can't afford to have a bland Mashiach. Pay too high a price to get here. So we raised the bar that the Mashiach will have to do a lot of things already. But in the Rambam says, the Rambam paskins like Shmuel, Ein bein yemos hamashiach lolam hazeh lo shibud malchius bilvad. The only difference between Yemos HaMashiach and now is that, in the UN they won't vote against us. So that's Mashiach. And the Rambam says specifically, he says it'll be a time when it'll be easier to make a living. But the Rambam says, al yadame, don't think that golden apples will fall off the tree. He said it'll be easier to make a living so people won't have to work so hard, so they'll have more time for intellect, for study, for Torah. So that's a great, it's all great, but it's not enough. Im shar hayesodos. So he says, I want you to know, kol ze nivne al yesodos dotim. These are the principles of our faith. Lo yashlichu yedias Hashem acharei gevom. Don't throw it away, the necessity to know God. Elo yosimu shifosom agdola vishtadlusom b'ma sheyaviu l'shleimus v'yikraveim laboram. The knowing of God, the intellect, will bring us closer to Him. Ashrei ish asher yishma el mitzvosecha. So it doesn't say Ashrei ish asher yishmor es mitzvosecha. That will observe. It says, Asher ish asher yishma, that he'll understand. He'll have an intellectual appreciation. Shein tzadik gomur, the only tzadik gomur that exists, the Rambam says, is a bal chochma she'ose mitzvos eila v'yodon borer. That he does mitzvahs and he knows clearly why he does mitzvahs. Well, that, you know, that's really, it's a radical idea. And it's one that really be hard to say that the masses could accept such an idea. And therefore, throughout Jewish history, this remained a controversial book. And this approach remained controversial. And to a great extent, the Jewish people ignored the Rambam in this matter. And they took the view that doing the mitzvahs, that's what makes you a tzaddik. One of the interesting things that happened in the Jewish world is that because this book was so controversial, they said the Rambam didn't mean it. Which is an example of something which occurs often in Jewish life, is that you take something that doesn't quite fit into current political correctness and you make it fit. So like in our time, you know, Samson Raphael Hirsch became an Eastern European Aguda member. Because somehow we have to deal with him that way. Can't deal with him in the reality of what he was because it doesn't fit into our current political correctness. So here many Rabbonim wrote, and here I'm quoting Rabbi Kapach, Rabim to'u, many have made this mistake, and they said that since the Rambam wrote this book to his Talmud, he had a Talmud in Baghdad, Rabbi Yosef ibn Eknin, and the Talmud wrote to him, the student wrote to him, and he said, Rebbe, what can we do? The Jewish people are falling away. In his time, just in every time, the Jewish people are falling away. They're falling away from Torah, from observance. They study Islamic philosophy. They're impressed by the outside world. What can I do to help restore that faith in Judaism? So the Rambam wrote, I'm writing you this book. This book is a tool for you to use. So, Dimu shelo nichtav vsefer ze ela nevochim. So here he says, we call it the nevochim. The Rambam didn't call it that. The Rambam, first of all, wrote it in Arabic. It was not written in Hebrew. And then we translated nevochim as being perplexed or confused. So it's the guide to the perplexed, to the confused. So then we say, well, the book was written for people who are confused, but I'm not confused, so I don't need the book. It was not written for me. It does not in any way reflect my problems. Dimu ki masha kosav Arambam shom, that ayin b'madoy apilosofio, that one should study philosophy, v'yeda in yoneim, and should know science and other things. So he said, that was only the Rambam wrote it for them because of the fact they were falling away. They were not strong in their faith. So he wrote this kind of a book. So this kind of a book is like a, what shall I say, a kiruv book in which we're trying to attract you, but it doesn't represent the real. Once we catch you, then we'll tell you the real thing, right? And Rabbi Kapach says, Af gdolim shogu baroa, even great men made this mistake. So he said, but they're mistaken. The Rambam meant it, and he meant it for every Jew. The Rambam didn't write it for confused people. The Rambam wrote it for Jews that felt that they were not confused at all. And because of that, therefore, the nevochim should be seen not as this kind of throwaway book, but as the book that is the basis for the Rambam's, not only the Rambam's philosophy, but the Rambam in halacha. There were two great people who lived in a little town. Well, I know Dvinsk is it's a little town in Latvia, even though in Latvia it was the second largest Jewish community after Riga. One was the Rogachover, Yosef Rosen, a genius, unbelievable genius. And the other was the Or Sameach, Meir Simcha Cohen, the author of the Meshech Chochmah. So he had these two great whales in a very small pond. And so, and the Rogachover was allegedly the Rav for the Chassidim, though that wasn't his field. And Meir Simcha was the Rav for the Misnagdim. They both had very similar views on a lot of things, even though because of the fact they were in the same town, they had problems with each other. What they both did is they took the more nevochim and used it lahalocha. In the Rogachover, many times, the Rogachover would answer, if you wrote him a shaila, so he would answer in 3 words, and then he would give you ayin, you know, look up here, 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 you know, 78 places, and he'd send it to you. And then, you know, you could spend months. The Rogachover called his book Tzofnas Paneach, because his name was Yosef. So that was Yosef's Egyptian name or Hebrew name, Tzofnas Paneach. But Tzofnas Paneach also means to uncover what is hidden, right? Lefaneach, to uncover what's tzafun, what's hidden. So there was a vsefer that came out in Israel not I think 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, I don't remember when I got the vsefer, fascinating vsefer. It's called Mefaneach Tzfunot, to discover what is hidden in the Rogachover. And it's just a fascinating book because the book is like 400 pages and he did like 4 or 5 questions in the Rogachover. But the Rogachover says many times, I am b'mor nevochim. Look in the more nevochim and you'll see. So the more nevochim to him is halacha. It's not philosophy. It's not a book of hashkafa. And Reb Meir Simcha also used the more nevochim lahalacha to answer tshuvas. And many times he used it in his famous commentary to the Yorah Chazoka, to the Rambam, to the Or Sameach. He brings a proof that his interpretation of what the Rambam means lahalocha is true, because in the Moreh Nevuchim this is what he wrote. So these people saw the Rambam as a whole, seamless, not divided, whereas most of the Jewish world was unable to accept that, and therefore they dealt with the Rambam as though he were different personalities. So there's the Rambam that's a doctor, and there's a Rambam that's a philosopher, and then there's a Rambam, you know, sits and learns, right? That he sits and learns and he writes for him. So you could pick and choose which Rambam you wanted. But it's obvious, in my opinion at least, that the truth of the matter is that the Rambam was all of these things at once, and that he was a person that was a genius beyond words, scholar beyond words, but that he was a whole person, and he saw all of this as being part of his personality. He didn't divide it amongst themselves. I want to conclude by reading you from the Moreh Nevuchim his example of Judaism. He has a parable. This is in the 3rd chelik and in the 51st section of the 3rd chapter. He says, he gives a great palace. So if we've ever gone to a great palace, so there are gardens outside, and after the gardens you come to the guard house, and after the guard house you come to the entrance to the palace. And after the entrance to the palace, you come to this great foyer. You don't walk in on the king immediately. And then there's a reception room. and then you finally get to the throne room. So the Rambam says that the Torah is like that too. In the throne room, Kaviyochel, is Yedias Hashem. On the outside, the gardens, that's the tradition of the Jewish people. The entrance is to do the mitzvahs. Then the knowledge of the Torah. Then knowledge, creativity itself, etc., etc., until finally, if you get all the way, then you can get in to see the king. He says many people are so impressed by the garden that they don't go in. The garden is beautiful. There are many people that are so impressed by the foyer, they don't go in. There are many people that don't realize that you're supposed to get in. So this is what he says. Amei Oretz ha'oskim b'mitzvahs. You hear how he calls them? Jews that do mitzvahs, they're Amei Oretz. They're, the ignorant people who do mitzvahs. Heim b'chotzer. They're happy to be in the courtyard, in the gardens. Those that go inside a little more, they already are wiser people. They believe the Jewish traditions, right? They believe in Sinai. I believe it, my grandfather told me. Oskim bedine masa avodos. So they perform mitzvahs and they serve God, but lo hisamku bi'iyun bi'yesodos hadas. They never spent any time to understand or deal with the foundations of our faith. Lo chokru klal al biru emes deya. They never thought about the truth of any of the things that exist in Judaism. Aval osam asher iskasku be'iyun bi'yesodos hadas, the next ones, who do spend time thinking about these things, kvar nichnasu el haprosdor, they're at least in the foyer. They're still not inside. Ubnei odom shom shonim b'malosam b'li sofek, without a doubt they're great people. Aval mi shehusgo lo ha'achocho al kol ma shehitivokach v'nizbarer lo mino enyonim elyonim kol ma she'efsher levarer oso. But someone who really wants to understand God, v'korov el anochon, and he comes close to what is true, kvar nimtzo im hamelech b'toch hachotzer. He got to the throne room. So he says here a fantastic idea. Moshe Rabbeinu is on Har Sinai for 40 days. He doesn't eat, he doesn't drink. How can he not eat or drink? The Rambam doesn't say it, he doesn't say it's a miracle. The Rambam never resorts to miracles, even when it's obvious that it is a miracle. His intellect doesn't allow him that. The Rambam says that Moshe Rabbeinu's seichel was so strong, he says that if a person becomes, so to speak, all seichel, he doesn't have to eat or drink. His bodily needs disappear from him. It's the ultimate diet, my friends. Lefi shekvar nischazek ha-seichel ad shenizbatel kol koach gas shebaguf. And therefore, he says, that's how Moshe did it. Moshe is in the inner sanctum. Avol mi shechoshev v'Hashem umarbel ezachro b'li yediyah. Someone that talks about God and prays to God and deals with God, but he has no understanding. Ela sheholech achar stam dimyon mesuyom. He goes after his imagination, how he imagines God should be, and we all build God in our image. We're built in God's image, but the truth of the matter is we build God in our image. So I saw, we'll go nameless, but a political party said, HaKadosh Baruch on the bus, on the side of the bus, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Anu Ma'aminim B'cha, vote this and this party. So God votes that party. So if you think about it, it's sacrilege. It's absolute sacrilege to say that. But we're convinced, you know, that God would vote Beis or Gimel or Shas, or how else would he vote? He has to vote the way I vote. Oh, achrei deya shekibel mizuloso. Or he believes in God in a way because somebody taught him something, and he never thought about it. And my Rebbe said it. Harehu ledati, in my opinion, heyoso michutz lechotzer. He isn't even in the garden. V'rochok mimenu. He is far away from God. Eino zocher Hashem be'emes. He doesn't really serve God. Ve'eino choshev bo. And he doesn't really think about God. He's worshiping his imagination. Kiyosu adovar shebinimyono. Because what he imagines, eino matim lemotzui klal, has nothing to do with the reality of God. Elohu mutzor sheyitzro dimyono. He invented God. Right? So God has a shrine, oh, God is this, God is, you know, that's how we see him. So those are very strong words. And as I mentioned, most of the Jewish people did not accept them. Either they couldn't imitate the Rambam, or that it was just too high a bar to cross. But that doesn't change the fact that he said it, and it doesn't change the fact that he meant it, and it doesn't change the fact that a little more knowledge, reality, rationalism could be used in the Jewish world today. And that it's not all mumbo-jumbo. And it's not all, you know, I heard the guy that got in the 38th seat for the Likud, what's his name? Kara, Ayub Kara. So I heard an interview with him in the morning before the soldier vote came in. So the sweet lady interviewer, I don't know where they get such wonderful people on Kol Yisrael, you know, that, you know, right away asks you, did you stop beating your wife yet? Or, you know, like, it's the first question. So she asked him, how does it feel to be number 38 when only 37 got in? That's the first question, right? How do you feel about it? So he says to her, he says, Nireh? He said, Arav Abu Chatzera hiftiach li shelikud yesh 38 mandat. Abu Chatzera promised him that they're going to have 38, so he believes, and they had 38. So what does the Rambam do with Abu Chatzera? So there's a famous legend with which I want to conclude. The Rambam said there are no shadim. There are no these spirits in the world, you know, and none of that doesn't exist. He doesn't believe in it. So the legend is, and the legend need not be true. All legends characterize people. Don't have to concentrate on the accuracy of it. So the legend is that the shadim had a convention. And they said, probably in the Renaissance, and they said, you know, if people don't believe, because in order for shadim to work, you have to believe in them. They only man the kapte adode, the Gemara says. Those that are makpid on shadim, so those are the ones that the shadim work on. But if you don't believe in shadim, so then they're out of business. So they said, now that the Rambam said there are no shadim, nobody's going to believe in us. What's going to be? We're going to be out of business. So they decided they'll put a demonstration in the backyard of the Rambam's house to show him that there are shadim. So there was a tornado and thunder and lightning, and the shadim put on a big show. So his son, Rabbeinu Avraham, said to him, Father, what do you say now about the shadim? And the Rambam is reputed to have said, there are no shadim. but in heaven they're testing me to see whether I believe there are no shadim. So there is no Abba Chatzeir, right? But in heaven they test us. But the Jewish people basically do believe in these things. And therefore the discussion of the Rambam remains very relevant until our time, simply because of the fact that the Rambam is certainly a minority. Now the Rambam is, the Meiri held with the Rambam, a great deal of the Maharal Prague is based on the Rambam. I think that many of the great fans of the Maharal Prague really never really read what he says, because he also is very, very different. It's interesting that the legend of the Golem should be attributed to the Maharal, when the Maharal himself, I don't think, would believe in the Golem. It's also interesting that the legend of the Golem didn't arise till 100 years after the Maharal died. So even though there are biographies written in the Jewish world of the Golem, and it's accepted as fact, the likelihood is not that way. But I think that it's in the darkness of our exile, in the troubles that the Jewish people have experienced, it's extremely difficult to maintain a rational position. The only way the Jewish people survived is by seeing supernatural things, by dealing with the irrational, by saying that there's a real world and this world is not the real world, and that in the real world somehow these bad things won't happen. And the whole idea of the great messianic era of exalted expectations. Part of the problem with Eretz Yisrael that we have is that it's real. It doesn't live up. You know, we thought the Jewish state. So we thought in the Jewish state, the city of Tel Aviv didn't have a jail till the 1920s. And the first 5 years or 4 years, there was nobody in the jail. So Bialik wrote an article that was published in Davar, I think. Bialik wrote an article that you have to have Yiddish Ganovim, he said. You have to have people in the jail. We're not going to be a real society. So his prediction came true in a way that, Baruch Hashem, there's no shortage. But the idea was that we could build a society without a jail. And because since we have a jail, and the jail is full, so we're disappointed in our society. Because we had these exalted ideas. But if it were not for the exalted ideas, we never would have had Tel Aviv either. We never would have come to that level. So that's the balance here. And the balance that Jewish history teaches us. But the ideas of the Rambam, the ideas of the more nevochim, have validity. They certainly have a place in our world, a world that unfortunately is real, and that can stand strong doses of realism and rationality. And that, combined with our faith and our belief, and with the fact that there are powers that we cannot easily explain, is the combination that allows the Jewish people to survive and prosper even until today.